All right. Welcome back, everyone, to another meeting of the Online Peace Science Colloquium. I'm Brad Smith. I'm an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University. If you're tuning in for the first time, I run this colloquium alongside Chelsea Estancona, who's an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina. We got a lot of USCs running around today, so this is a little confusing for me. So if you're tuning in for the first time, we're an online colloquium series that's associated with the Peace Science Society. And our goal is to bring the excellent research that happens at the Society's annual meeting and conference to you in your homes or offices or wherever else you might be all year round. So today we're really excited to have a presentation by Xin Nong, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Texas at Austin. They're going to be presenting succession norms and autocratic survival, evidence from ancient China. And we have an excellent discussant who's an expert on these topics. We have David Kang, who's the Maria Crutcher Professor of International Relations at the University of Southern California. So with that, Xin, I'll turn it over to you. You can go ahead and share your screen, and we'll sit back for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Bradley. Let me share my screen. So let's see. Could you all see it?
Yes, looks great.
Right. So yeah, thanks for the introduction. And today I'm happy to share my works on the institutionalization of succession norms and autocratic survival with evidence from historical China. And this is the structure of my presentation. And let's first talk about motivation. Right? So 2 years ago, Elon Musk tweeted a Chinese poem. And many people around the world were trying to figure out what it means. Its meaning is quite simple. We are brothers. Why do we need to fight each other? It's a poem we learned in middle school in China. And the story behind it is that like two brothers were competing to succeed a throne in the era of Three Kingdom period. And one day, the elder brother said, "My dear younger brother, I hear that you are very talented at writing poems. Could you make a poem in 7 steps? Otherwise, I'll kill you for spreading the rumor." So this is the real published or perish thing, right? But like, and guess what? The younger brother made this poem written here, right, in 7 steps. So this story shows that succession issue is very important, not only for the tech companies, but also for dynasties. And even in the modern world, like over 300 autocrats lost their office in a non-constitutional way since World War II. And among them, over 2/3 were removed by domestic elites. And scholars have established that formal institutions such as constitutions, legislatures, parties, and elections, they all contribute to the survival of autocrats. However, we still don't know much whether informal institutions have similar effects. And as Henke and Levitsky pointed out, institutions matter. And indeed, throughout human history, succession rules were informal most of the time, like the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire in India, and most Arab dynasties and most Chinese empires. They did not have formal succession rules. Before moving forward, let's clarify what I mean by informal institutions and norms. Throughout my presentation, I use those words interchangeably. They are unwritten rules understood by members of a community, and they do not have officially sanctioned channels. So scholars have found that like social norms, such as like the nuclear taboo, the norm of self-determination, and human rights norms, they are very powerful in shaping behavior, right? But why would people follow norms? The first camp argue that people follow norms because of potential punishment. And the second camp argues that people follow norms because of internalization. For example, if you are invited to your friend's birthday party, you would always bring a present, right? You do that not because of potential punishment by your friend. At worst, you may not be invited next year, right? You do that, you bring a gift because you believe this is the right thing to do, right? So to summarize, norms are powerful, even if there are no officially sanctioned channels. So how would succession norms work? let's take a time machine and travel back to the Neolithic period, right? Back then, individuals with particular traits are more likely to become leaders. That is to say, like the strongest or the tallest or the best hunters, they were more likely to become leaders in that period. And as a small-scale egalitarian community gradually transitioned to a large-scale hierarchical society, the issue of power transition became more prominent. And through repeated interactions, the elite realized that it is better to have succession rules. And that's why hereditary succession gradually replaced meritocracy. And even according to the Sumerian king list, even in the earliest dynasties in Mesopotamia, they already practiced some type of hereditary succession rules. And those rules basically exclude many people from potential successors, right? This is no longer meritocracy. This is like hereditary. So many people were excluded from potential successors. But why would people agree to that, right? That's because the cost of picking the wrong side outweighs any cost. In ancient China, if you pick the wrong side in the Game of Thrones, then you and your whole family will be executed, right? So the cost is too high. Instead of like picking a side and see if it works out or not, right? They prefer to have like some norms that can facilitate this pressure process. So in China, succession rules gradually changed from horizontal succession norms to vertical succession norms. And horizontal means basically like sons, right? And horizontal means brothers should succeed the throne. And under vertical succession norms, sons should succeed the throne. So in the Shang dynasty, like 13 of the 29 kings were succeeded by brothers and 16 by sons. It's like probably like even a split between sons and brothers. And then in the Zhou dynasty, like only 10 of 36 kings were succeeded by brothers. And since the Han dynasty, brothers were basically excluded from potential rival successors. Those things are not only the de facto succession reflected this pattern, but also the debates among the elites also reflected this issue. Like in the Shang and Zhou dynasties, there's a debate about whether brothers or sons should have the right to succeed the throne. But since the Han dynasty, there were no debate. Basically, brothers were not considered as the rightful successor of unless there's some egregious behavior by the sons, right? So my theory goes that like as the succession rules become more institutionalized, like the candidate pool become narrower, and it becomes easier for the elite to coordinate and agree on a successor. And I suspect that these effects should be stronger when the elite competition is more fierce. So here are my two hypotheses. Right? The institutionalization of vertical succession norms should reduce monarchs of being deposed by the domestic elite, and this effect should be stronger when elite competition is more fierce. And I'll talk more about what elite competition means later in the data section. So those are the countries in my sample, right? So you can see that in this slide, right? In the center, there's a Zhou, right? A small green area called Zhou. This is the royal family of the Zhou dynasties. And all the other states, they used to be the vassal states of the Zhou royal family. And however, those vassal states could collect their own taxes and build an army. And over time, those vassal states became much more stronger and even more stronger than the Zhou dynasty. And gradually, this decentralized system that gradually becomes like an international system, and those states no longer pay tribute, to the Zhou dynasty. This is the spring-autumn period, and this is the Warring States era. Like originally, there were over like 100 vassal states, but like you see, like in the Warring States period, like only 7 major states, left in this period. So one challenge in my study is how to measure norms, right? It is very difficult to measure. And there are 2 best practices. One is to measure social norms using belief and expectations. this is usually done, in lab experiments. And the other way to measure norm is to use recurrent patterns of behavior. And in my study, I also use like two different measures. The first measure is based on historian accounts. The historians, they pay a close look at the elite debates during that period. And this is like arguably the closest thing we get to normative belief. And the second measure is to use recurrent patterns of de facto succession behavior. And here I call the institutionalization of vertical succession norms as one if we observe 5 consecutive successions by sons or a state. And in the robustness checks, I also explore like different thresholds. This is what the data looks like for my measurement. And we can see that as the institutionalization of vertical succession norms became stronger, a higher percentage of monarchs were succeeded by their sons. So in order to collect my data, I basically rely on two sources. First is a Zor commentary, and the second is the records of the grand historians. And when there's a conflict between two sources, which is rare, I cross-reference other sources. And even so, like most monarchs do not have a birth certificate. We care about like people's deaths in China, but we don't care like when they were born. So unfortunately, I cannot control for monarch's age in my paper, but I discuss like how I can use a remedy for this thing. So together, I have like 367 monarchs in my sample, and 10 of them appeared twice. They were removed from office, and then they came back to the office with the help of like a foreign country. Afterwards. So in my paper, I only look at the first tenure of a monarch, and I exclude those second appearance, 10th time second appearance. Like the results are basically the same if I include them. We can see that most monarchs die in office naturally, and the second largest category for a monarch's exit is removed by coup. So in my paper, the unit of analysis is monarch. And we have like 357 monarchs from 17 states over a 500 period. And the dependent variable is time to failure. The failure here is defined as like removed by coup. And the key independent variable is like the institutionalization of vertical succession norms. I control for a set of variables, including state capacity. I use two novel measurements for state capacity. First is the number of newly created counties in each state. And this variable is measured twice for each state, once in the spring-autumn period and another time for the warring states period. And another measurement is to use the number of official titles for each state, also measured twice for each country. And also control for external threat, which is measured as the number of times a state being attacked by a foreign state. And also control for predecessors' time in office and the exit mode of the predecessors. And the baseline model is a Cox proportional hazard model with shear frailty, which is like a shear frailty basically means like a random effects in panel analysis. And this is the summary table of my data. And this figure basically shows that the assumption of my model holds. So, and this is the result. We can see that like the coefficients for my key independent variables are always negative and statistically significant across all models, which provides support for my first hypothesis. And sensitivity analysis shows that my results are pretty robust. It's not as robust as like smoking and lung cancer, but it is as robust as like the relationship between like a pregnant mother's smoking status and infant birth weight. So I conduct a lot of robustness checks, including like stratification and survival models, which is analogous to country fixed effects. Also include like century fixed effects, and I exclude some short-lived monarchs and control for the relationship between a monarch and her predecessor. Also estimate like competing risk models, and I explore like different thresholds to measure my key independent variables, and the results are pretty robust. To address potential concerns of endogeneity, namely that like some states that already consolidated power are more likely to have a stronger institutionalization of succession norms. I explore instrumental variable approaches. Here, my instrument is the ancestral distance of each state's founding father to the royal families of previous dynasties. And the idea is that the Shang and Zhou dynasty practiced both horizontal and vertical succession norms. And the closer a state's founding fathers were to the Shang and Zhou royal families, the weaker its vertical succession norms institutionalization. I also discussed other potential instrumental variables, like we can also consider like using like the distance to the Zhou capital as like instrumental variable. But as we can see, I mean, in the previous figure, the Zhou, I mean, located in the central part of China, and there's not many variation of the distance from, I mean, each state's capital to the Zhou dynasty. So this ancestral distance is a better instrument than like, say, geographical distance. And in my first stage regression, we can see that the F stats is larger than 10, which provides some confidence for the relevance assumption for the instrumental variable. And another key assumption in instrumental variable is that it's the exclusion restriction assumption, which means that the instrument should only affect your dependent variable through its effects on the endogenous variable. And here, a concern is that vassals closer to the royal families were assigned to better or larger lands, right? But this is a real concern, right? But like there were over 100 vassal states initially, and many of them already migrated hundreds or thousands of miles from their designated areas. So the maps I showed you before, they did not reflect, I mean, the original place of when those countries were first created, right? And it's plausible that conditional on state capacity and external threats, and I mean, ancestral distance only affects a monarch's survival through its effects on succession norms. And here's the results of instrumental variables. We can see that like the coefficient for my key independent variable is still negative and significant across all models. And the F stats is larger than 10 once we control for state capacity and external threats. And the results, I mean, are pretty similar, even in the bare-bone model without any control variables. Now let's explore a potential mechanism of elite competition. Elite competition arises from two potential sources. First is competition within royal families, within potential throne successors. And the second source is competition between royal families and the aristocratic lineages. Because I do not have global data of all potential successors, I focus on the second source of elite competition in my paper. And aristocratic lineages refers to those powerful and influential families in ancient China. An example is the Three Huan in the state of Lu. Those aristocratic lineages, they usually sit behind the scene instead of trying to become the king themselves. I mean, again, I'm happy to chat more about it, why they choose to do that, but like, yeah, happy to talk more about it in the Q&A section. So I measure elite competition using the number of generations of the aristocratic lineages in a state. Data is from He Huaihong's book, and Zhao Dingxin used this data in a similar way in his book. And if an example, here's an example. If a state had 3 aristocratic lineages, one lasted for 9 generations, and the other 2 lasted for 5 generations, then the total number is 9 plus 5 times 2 is 19. So I interact this measurement of elite competition with my key independent variable and re-estimate the models. And we can see that the interaction terms are always negative and significant in 2 of the 4 models. While this is not a very strong result, it provides some supporting evidence that like the institutionalization of succession rules moderates the adverse impact of elite competition on monarchs' tenure. I also compare like the informal succession rules in China to the formal succession rules in European states. And I find that there's no evidence that informal succession rules were inferior to their formal counterparts. And I also extend my analysis to modern autocracies. And I basically find that like in states where the leader came into power right after their fathers, those regimes are more stable compared to other autocratic regimes that did not get their power from their fathers. So here are the key findings on my paper. And a broader implication is that we may underestimate authoritarian resilience if we ignore informal institutions. Like if my theory is correct, I would expect that like the regime in North Korea and Syria, they are pretty resilient. And here are my key contributions. This paper uncovers a new mechanism, and it shows that norms matter, even in high politics. And it challenges Eurocentric approaches, and it improves our understanding of a pivotal episode of Chinese history. And thank you very much for listening. You can find this full paper, on my website. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Shin, for that excellent presentation. Before I turn the floor over to David for comments, Shin, if you could contextualize the paper a little bit. I know you mentioned before that this was a part of your dissertation, so could you just sort of like walk us through where you're at with the paper, what kinds of feedback would be most useful? Just give us a little context before we go into the discussion and Q&A.
Yes, thank you very much. So this is like one of the 3 essays of my dissertation, and my dissertation is about how leaders make decisions, in the Game of Thrones in ancient China. I also have another paper which explores how does leadership turnover affects the likelihood of interstate war onset. And also have the third paper is about how does war outcome affects the fate of the generals. Yes, and this paper is rejected by AJPS recently, and I haven't decided which journal to send it to. And I look forward to feedbacks to improve my paper. And I think the most helpful comments would be like, how to address the concerns like, I just don't believe your measurement. Like how can I have a better measurement for the institutionalization of succession norms? And another key issue is like the theory, like, yes, how can I say something more about elite coordination? Instead of say, oh, they coordinate with each other, but what can I do like to improve the theoretical section on paper? Like how the elites coordinate with each other, and how can I show that, like, if possible, like empirically in my paper?
Okay, great. Thanks, Shin, for helping us frame the discussion. David, I'll turn the floor over to you. We can sort of proceed however you think is most useful. We can either take your comments one by one, or you can download a bunch of them.
Why don't I do it? I'll do a little more than 5 minutes because I'm the only discussant, right? But I won't take too long. But I want to do a couple things. And the first one is say, of course, I loved reading this paper, and I'm the wrong audience because I'm primed to love the paper, right? So I think anything where we're using new and interesting data from other parts of the world is really important. So in general, I think this is great. And most of my comments are going to be trying to help you make it so that you can take what you've got and then present it to a wider audience that's going to say, okay, I care about what you found or what the arguments you're making. But before that, I'm going to do something, because you are a graduate student, I'm going to give you some advice about how to present. Okay? Because you really need it. And here's the thing. If I hadn't read that paper, so much information came and went. I mean, you're throwing these massive regressions at us with like 5 different models in literally less than a minute. Nobody can read it that quick. For a presentation, it's different than a paper. It's totally different than a paper. In a paper, I can stop and pore over one chart and read it and go back and look at the numbers and stuff like that. And then I can control when I go forward again. Or I can read one and then I can go back and say, oh, what happened to that one? Oh, wait a minute, I didn't understand that first one the right way. A presentation is totally different. There is so much less information that people can take in. And what you did is what every graduate student does, which is they take a 40-page paper and they try and cram it into 15-minute presentation. Right? And a paper is not a talk, right? So to present this, like anyone else watching this is going to have to download your paper first to have an idea of what's going on. And that's fine. But in a way, what you want to be able to do is simplify, because those regressions don't interpret themselves. So for a presentation, you want one or two that just highlight what you're doing, and everything else you can talk about later. Robustness checks or validity, you want us to be able to follow that very straightforward fundamental argument that you're making about vertical succession norms lead to fewer coups or whatever, longer elite leader survival, and walk us through that. And so in general, it's really hard to learn how to do that, because it's so much easier to just present a bunch of stuff. But even I, having read the paper, couldn't keep up with the slides, right? So that's just something really important, and it'll help you when you're doing other presentations, okay? So that's just comment number one. And I say this to every grad student I see, because we all do it, right? Less is more in a talk. It's just so much harder to follow what I'm saying than what I get to read, right? Okay, so hopefully that's gold right there, buddy. But anyway, right? So onto the paper. I really like this paper. I think it's great. I think, if I've understood correctly, your dependent variable is survival or coup, coup likelihood or whatever, and then it's higher horizontal versus vertical norms, succession norms. Now, early on in the paper, you say, I'm not going to argue that one is better than the other. I think it's on page 1. That's on page 2. We do not argue that one succession norm is superior to the other, right? Mm-hmm. I would submit to you that you do. You haven't convinced me that they're both the same. Or the way to put it is on multiple dimensions. You need to give me some different dimension, because if I'm the ruler, I thanks for the shout out for me in Haggard's book, or Wang Yuhua, right? Yuhua Wang at Harvard. His whole new book is about ruler succession, and in Tang they had better capacity, but the rulers were much more likely to be deposed by coup, and then they changed, and then under Ming and Qing dynasties they had lower state capacity, but they could survive longer. Now, whether or not you agree with his argument or the evidence he has or something like that, if I'm the ruler, the first thing I thought when I was like when I was reading his book was like, I don't care about, if I'm emperor, I care about me, right? I care about surviving, which raises a massive question for his stuff about, like, why did all the Tang leaders not wise up, and how did the other guys wise up? I mean, it's a different question. But for you, I want to see what the horizontal succession norms maximized or did in opposition to or differently than survival. Because most rulers, like if I'm king, that's my number one priority, right? So if horizontal norms do something, then I'd like to at least know what it is, because then I could see how the trade-off came over time. Because here's the largest question I had about your argument. You have, like, again, it's in there, but, from Shang, from like 1700 BC, for at least 600 years, you have it horizontal succession norms, right? Till you have the transition period coming sometime around Western Zhou. Yeah. And then sometime at the end of Warring States, we end up with vertical, which is, 200 BC. So it took Chinese rulers 370 of them, or even more, 1,000 years to figure this out. Yeah. So what I ask is, in some ways, I think something went on there that caused everybody to change. And I don't know nearly enough about how royal palaces worked or something like that, right? But if they're doing it, I mean, ostensibly, you would have a I don't know what you want to call it, a market mechanism by which you'd realize, wow, I'm going to do better here. And eventually everybody, it's some tipping point or something where everybody goes over to a vertical succession norm if it's better for the ruler, right? So I really want to know why they survived so long for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And then they all shifted roughly at the same time. And again, the span of Chinese history is so big that same time is like 200 years. It's like the length that America's existed, right? But to me, that was the biggest question that came out of all the stuff. You've put so much effort into figuring this out. I will make a comment about measurement, which I don't think, you're never going to satisfy people on that, but I'll get to there. But to me, it's always theory over method. I want to know these arguments first. I want to be able to follow them in my head before we get into robustness checks or blah, 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 right? I really want to know what the story is, what the argument is. And there, I'm not sure what caused that change, especially when you're interested in norms. Because in some ways, what you're saying is this is a practical norm. It's practical because I'll live longer. And then eventually it became a norm that's a norm, which in some ways I'd like to see. And I'm going to tell you a story. Because when I think about this, you know how Korea is very much a oldest son, male-dominated society. Did you know that that's actually relatively recent? Joseon Dynasty. Into the Goryeo Dynasty, which was 900 to 1200, and before, Korea had girls. It was, I forget the terms now because I haven't paid attention. I mean, this is just something I sort of know, and I should have looked it up. But anyway, girls could inherit equally to boys. It was just divided up. So all the stuff about a very sexist or whatever male-dominated society came very late. There are these family registries. Every Korean family had a family registry, a chokbo, right? It's like sort of the hogu, however you pronounce it in Chinese, right? Yeah. A family registry. Yeah. And the girls were put in just like the boys, et cetera, et cetera. Around the founding of the Joseon Dynasty, there was an intensification of Confucian norms. And the government started to say, only the male should be in, and it should be primogeniture or eldest son inherits everything. Jangson, right? So oldest son of the oldest son. Society, people resisted so much that they would just keep putting their daughters in and stuff like that, and they wouldn't do it. That the government then started to say, you can't take the civil service exam unless you follow the rules. So over time, eventually everybody did it, and then they forgot about it. And now it's just sort of assumed to be cultural, but it was as much for practical. It was cultural in the sense that this was imposed as a belief about the proper role of the family and the state in a neo-Confucian beliefs. It was clearly a belief, but it was also made practical because you needed to follow the beliefs of the current government in order to be successful and inherit stuff like that. Now, I say this because that was my running dialogue with you during the whole thing. It's like, why did it change? Why did it not? And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this story is just a story I sort of read, as I sort of grew up or whatever, about how Korea changed. Maybe that's a thin layer. And in reality, it was too many Goryeo kings were getting lopped off or something. I mean, I don't think so. I did a check for Joseon, and there's not a whole lot of, I just roughly tried to look how many kings got deposed or coup, and it's like 1 or 2 out of 25. But I didn't go back to Goryeo. Again, the data is, I just didn't have enough time, right? But I don't want to tell. The worst thing you want for a discussant or a referee is to say, do the paper I want instead of the paper you wrote. But if you want a robustness check, I would look at Korea and see, right? Like, when did they change and why? Or Japan. Right? They're all roughly this sort of similar thing, and they're all East Asian. So in some ways, you'd be controlling for a whole lot of other factors if you look at when Korea changed. And I could be wrong because I haven't paid attention to this, right? But that's what I wonder. When I read your paper, I wonder, what were these norms and why did they change? And how did that interact with, I say this very carefully or very aware that this might be sending you down the wrong path, or people think I'm a moron, right? But what if the rise of Confucianism in the late, Qin, Han, etc., led to different beliefs about who should do what? I have no idea. right? I have no idea. But I do know that isn't that famous, some Confucian scholar went up to the, what's his name? In Han and said, you should read these books. And he's on his horse and he's like, I conquered the kingdom with a sword. What do I need your books for? And the scholar said, you might conquer it that way, but you're not going to rule it that way. You know? So I don't know, right? I don't know. But that's what I was thinking in terms of the model, in terms of your causal arguments. I really wonder what those norms were. Okay? Let me hurry up and then we can talk. Two other thoughts, then we'll talk about measuring. Let me make sure it's over here. So one of the thoughts was some of those robustness checks, I didn't quite follow the logic, and you can just, you can tell me or whatever else, of why you would see ancestral distance, why you would expect that has some kind of systematic effect from the. I literally have no idea, right? I don't know enough about ancient China, but why the farther away you are, you would behave differently than if you were close to, Shang or Zhou or something like that, right? Because you're making these arguments, and so I want to know what the logic is, what you think is causing what, and how it's working out. Okay, my last substantive question would be, again, if you can sharpen the so what question or the so what answer, I think we'll all be better off, right? Meaning, what's at stake? What are we unlearning or relearning or whatever if you're right? Right? If you're right that these informal norms have some kind of critical effect, and this is why they do it, what do we have to unlearn? You sort of have in there formal versus informal institutions, right? Like, everyone looks at formal institutions. I'm looking at informal. I think that's great. I don't think it's that, what I mean? I'm totally willing to think there are different types of norms or different types of institutions, fine, right? But what is at stake if you're right? And how are we going to have to rethink the world if these vertical succession norms are better? Because in some ways, I was trying to think what it would be like, right? And I know, for example, like Mongols always did some kind of a fight, right?
Yeah,
they always had, I forget what they called it, but they would have the thing where you all get together and they wouldn't necessarily fight, but they would have to sort out who would get to take over. But they were a totally different cultural system, right? That was a semi-nomadic, blah, 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 blah. But I do know that some continued on 1,000 years after you were, the area you're talking about. So I'd really be interested in what, if there's some efficiency thing, why that happened, right? But sharpening is so what? So my last comment on measurement is, I was sure that someone was going to say something, right? I was wondering, right? I mean, I'm deeply, there's a lot of people in China, even back then, like, how are you really gonna, be able to trace these names and numbers? I'm not saying you shouldn't try and do it. In some ways, that's almost an impossible standard for us to have the kind of data we want, okay? On the other hand, if you can make as explicit, or I don't know what the word is, careful a claim using this data as possible, I, for one, am totally willing to do that. Because I think in many ways, like China, the East Asian societies have in many ways better written records than like any other region of the world. And so the more we use them, I think the better. Again, Wang Yuhua, Yuhua Wang, he did like tombstone things, but they had scribes from 2,000 years ago writing down everything that happened every day on a daily basis in all these, in all these kingdoms, right? So by the time we get back to Shang and Zhou, I think everybody thinks most of those are myth. It's not really hard to take seriously, right? A lot of the records you're talking about, I remember when, someone else wrote a book using, on Warring States era and used all the stories. I was always told that many of those stories were used as much like parables, as not, as like from the Bible, right? Like, as an example to teach a story. And because they were fascinating, that's one reason the role of individuals looks so good, because people love a story about, brilliant thinker or blah, 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 right? So I don't know how to answer the measurement story other than I think you should do as much as you can. And I know you will never have the kind of legitimacy or whatever of using that data that will satisfy some people. And I think what you need to be able to do is make a good enough or a strong enough argument that you've got something there and it's plausible, and then you go. I mean, if you were to go up 1,000 years, you would have way better data, right? I know Korean kings from Shilla dynasty, 500 AD, have had very good data, right? Tang, but by then they might have already been,
Yeah, it might already be.
Yeah, it's already, you may have nothing, you have no variation on the dependent variable. Anyway, those are my basic points. I thought it was great. I think you have a lot of work to do, young man. So get back to work.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes. May I ask like clarification question very quick? Like
yes, of course. Yeah, no, we take the rest of the time. We can have a discussion.
Yeah, you talk about like the changes in succession norms, succession rules in Korea, right? And like is it a change in the royal succession or like for all the people for possession succession or something like?
Well, it up and down.
Up and down.
Right? So families had to change. I actually am not. I think the kings tended to always. Actually, that's a great question. I think the kings, boy, tended to be. I actually have. Here's the thing. Half the time there's a concubine or somebody dies, so they adopt somebody in.
Yeah.
So I haven't done a system, but I think mostly it was vertical, not horizontal.
Yeah.
Right. Even there, even like Wangon, the founder of Koryo dynasty or Shilla, they all tended to be within families, and I think by generation. So maybe the royal family. Boy, I couldn't tell you. Again, I literally have never ever done more than like, I've never looked at this systematically. It's just sort of history I sort of know, right?
Yeah, it's complicated, professional rules. So.
Yeah. Because in part, even if you have sons, there can be a battle over who gets it. That's why sort of the eldest son is better. That makes it very clear that you just go down by who was born first, right? But a lot of times there can be real difficulties if you got more than one son or more than one wife, right? And I don't want to tell too many stories, but an example is the founder of Chosun Dynasty had 2 wives. The first wife had the second wife's sons killed to make sure that they wouldn't challenge for her, So it doesn't eliminate it. So there might, I don't know. I don't have any idea how you would measure that, right?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
So I had a couple of thoughts. I think so. I had a very similar, and I'll caveat this by saying, this is very far outside of my area of expertise. Like I don't, but I think just sort of as coming at it from kind of an IR perspective, I wanted to know basically the same exact thing that Dave brought up, where I think the question that this raises is why was there the change, right? And so I understand that the thing you're sort of interested in is explaining the effect of the change and not necessarily the change itself. But you get to this part in page 14 where you're discussing sort of the 3 broad explanations that historians have come up with for the change, and I read that as sort of a necessary part of doing the quantitative analysis, which is, well, we need to make sure that there's not things that are causing the change and the outcome, and I'm going to control for this stuff. But I thought this should be further up in the paper, right? Because that to me seems like an opportunity to illustrate as the change happened, right? Give some stories, right? I think it might, I think it would be really helpful because, these stories Dave is sort of alluding to, like that, I think having that in the paper could be really useful to help to flesh out and illustrate your theory, right? Yeah. Because I had it in my mind, as I was reading, I want some examples from this history so that I can have some idea about what these data points mean, right? And so in particular, the thing that I thought would have been most useful for myself was a story tell us a story of a leader that died and there was a clean succession, right? Because that, to me, that seems like where there'd be the most friction. Right. And so, sort of, and if you can demonstrate to us that the succession was not very clean in the previous period when we had this horizontal norm, but it was quite clean, even if you're cherry picking the examples, right? Because, cherry pick the examples to illustrate, right? To kind of give us the best case, and then say, now I'm going to look at the data and show you that, there's a pattern in the data that's consistent with this, with the cherry picked examples, right? The other thing was, and this is just a point of curiosity, having thought about this for the 46 minutes that we've been in here, explanation for the transition is, I wonder if there's a story to tell about sort of the regularization of rule, right? Wherein the horizontal succession norm benefits you when, my brother, who is 4 years younger than me, has been basically ruling alongside me and knows how to do it. And he's more attractive than my 17-year-old son, who has no idea what he's doing.
Yeah.
But then once the dynasty's been around for quite some time, it's much easier to turn it over to my irresponsible young child. And so is that, because I couldn't get out of my head as I read the same question Dave had, which is, why were they ever doing it the other way if it's so much more stable to have the vertical succession norm? And I think that's like an opportunity. I think that's an opportunity for you to sort of think through another potential contribution of the paper. Because if you can offer an explanation for that, I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes. Yeah. Yes. At some point, I wonder if I should write a formal model to illustrate this mechanism, and yeah. Maybe I should consider formal model to try to formalize the ideas and what actors, what the costs and benefits of vertical versus horizontal norms. And
sorry.
Yes.
All good. Yeah, but I don't want to derail the conversation, but I did want to sort of emphasize that I had basically the same reaction about that seems like something that's a natural question that this raises, and that doesn't have to be the main thing this paper is about, but I do think our readers are going to want to know an answer to that.
Yes, I also plan to write another paper on the evolution of succession norms across all cultures of dynasties. I talked with John Gehring, and we were trying to write a new paper on how to explain the evolution of succession norms, depending on I don't know, the natural endowments they have, we talk about the Mongolia, they all have the sons fight each other, but it's almost always the case that they kind of favor the youngest son in Mongolia succession. They kind of force the eldest son to create his own territory and do something. Then always favor the youngest son to pass down most possessions to the youngest son in Mongolia. But yeah, it's a cultural thing, and yes, I should definitely talk about it more. Why there was a change in the succession norm? Why it took so long for this shift of succession norms? There's no, as far as I know, there's no a shock or something that this is a clear cut year at which this norm transition occur, right? There's no a sharp change in my independent variable, and yes, it's tough and do not have a sharp change.
Do you know, is it the, sorry, go ahead, David.
No, go ahead.
Is it the case that life expectancies were increasing over this time? This could be this could be consistent with the idea that when you'd be handing it over to a child who is going to be, effectively manipulated by whatever other adults are around, that it's maybe more effective to just hand it over to your brother.
I'm not sure. Things we do not have life expectancy data at that time.
You mentioned this in the paper, yeah. Anyway, I think Dave was going to make a point.
Yeah, I don't know. It wasn't that important anyway. Yeah. Do you have go ahead.
So I have a question. Like, when I try to say something about, I don't know, like some implications of the paper for the modern politics, for politics today, I don't know. I got some feedback saying, "Oh, you are extended too much." Like, one thing I want to say that, like, if the logic holds, it's that it would expect that, like, the authoritarian regimes like North Korea, like Syria, or even China, like, who did not have like very formal succession rules, like to be quite stable. If my logic holds, is that like I don't know, extension, like extend my paper too much, or like I don't know. I hesitated whether I should say something in my paper or just like cut it out. It seems like different people have different opinions, and I don't know. Just I got conflicting feedbacks for this part.
I think this well, here's how I would answer it off the top of my head, right? It goes back to whatever so what you want us to know about.
Yeah.
And if that so what is about survival, then maybe in some way you could say it also works today. But if you're aiming your guns at formal versus informal institutions or something else, then you don't need to do that, right? And I'm not sure. I know you're sort of generally interested in autocratic survival. It seems to be like everyone and their cousin is writing about that these days, right? You know, the dictator's dilemma and
all the cool kids are writing about it.
Yeah, you know, the autocrats dilemma, whatever, verse or something. But if you're interested in authoritarian survival, it's one thing. But if you're interested in how norms develop and how institutions develop, then it's totally different, right?
Yeah, I see.
Yeah,
I'll think about it.
Yeah. I mean, the thing about doing stuff like this is, I think, you know, more broadly about what you're doing in terms of using Chinese history, is that we're in a place that 20 years ago I didn't ever expect us to be, where there's so much more willingness or acceptance to even think about using this stuff. And I think that's great. The danger is, and I've refereed a bunch of papers where people are just diving into some data and then saying, I found some data, you know, I get it's too Eurocentric, let's go, but they don't really know why they're diving into it. And so that makes it very difficult then to come back to the so what and say, other than I've got some cool data, why do I care about what you've learned? Right? And so if you can do that better, I think it'll be totally published. But there's lots of stuff out there now that might be good methodologically or using this ancient data, but we want to know what we care about, right? So what do I have to think differently? You know, and I'll say I got the easy stuff because is war the same everywhere? I mean, this is a fundamental question, and I was sure it wasn't. And I spent years reading, you know, coding those books and stuff like that. But it's an obvious thing that everybody cares about. Everybody gets mad. Is it good, right? They're all pissed. No, it wasn't, or whatever. You know, and that's what you want, is you want people to be like, wait a minute now, or I never thought of that. And if you can get that, you'll be golden.
I'll try.
Yeah, try. Be better. No, I don't know. Yeah, that's about
all right. Well, we're getting close to time. So so Xin, do you have any last thoughts, or I'll make sure we sort of collect everything before we wrap up here.
Yes, on like how to clarify like why my instrumental variable works, like the relevance thing, like
yeah.
So I think I didn't explain clearly in the paper, but my idea is that like those states with like a founding father closer to the previous dynasties, royal families, like they were also more similar in culture. So when they just like founded, right, when those founders just like copy what they learned from the previous royal families, and they're similar in culture, and that's why they are slower in the transition to the vertical succession norms. Is that clear, or like?
I mean, okay, maybe, right? Because sometimes when you found a new dynasty, you're like, I'm done with that. This is why I'm founding a new one, right? So I mean, I'm not saying one is either or, right? But But often I think a new dynasty, and the first thing they do is distance themselves and justify why they're doing something new, you know?
Yeah.
So it could be both, or it could, one time this, one time that, but that's the first thing I think of.
Yeah. So I think for making the instrument convincing, I think that's another opportunity to bring in some of the qualitative information.
Yeah.
Right. Because like sort of explain, like give us a couple cases, even if it's just a paragraph contrasting two, and say like, here's one where the instrument takes this value and the actual measure takes this value correspondingly, and this is why, right? And here's another one, and sort of like help us think through, because I had a little bit of a hard, because I'm thinking about these like family trees and hypotheticals, and it's a little hard for me to track, right? And I think if I had a couple examples to grab onto, it would really help.
Yeah.
And that'll force you to clarify your logic as well.
I see. I'll do that. Yeah, I have that already. Just need to express it clearly. I see. Good. Thank you.
All right. Well, I want to thank both of you. Shin, this is really nice work. I look forward to seeing how it develops.
Yep.
Dave, thanks for the excellent discussing comments. I knew you'd be the perfect person to discuss this. So
happy to do so.
All right. Well, tune in. Our next session will be on May 12th. And we'll be sending out an email to the Peace Science listserv. So we hope to see you then. In the meantime, take care.
All right. Bye.
Thank you.